we move into the third agenda item, which is the presentation of the condition of the West Seattle Bridge. I believe we have our presenters online, which include Sam Zimbabwe, who is the director of SDOT, Lori Williams, Matthew Donahue, and Adam Emery, all with the Seattle Department of Transportation. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over and have the department give us a presentation. Unless Council Member Peterson or Herbal, do you have some introductory remarks you want to make before the presentation starts?
If I could, I just have a couple of introductory remarks. I'll make it really quick.
Go, please.
Thank you. I just want to thank SDOT for their quick agreement to participate in this briefing. As you can imagine, constituents in District 1 were really shocked at the short notice of the closure. There's universal support for the fastest action possible for West Seattle. This is a second emergency layered upon the COVID-19 emergency. For me, the key questions are, how long is the upper bridge going to be usable? What can the council do to assist the quickest action possible? Whether or not that's funding or permitting assistance. We need to know how long it's going to take to complete the repairs. If we don't know now, when will we have an estimate? And also getting a sense of how much work that SDOT is doing right now. And I also want to thank SDOT for its quick response to the many requests for traffic management mitigation measures and the work that they're already doing on putting in a temporary stoplight at Highland Park and Holden, because so many of the cars are getting off of the First Avenue Bridge and coming up the hill. So that's all I have for right now.
Thank you, Councilmember Herbold. Councilmember Peterson is chair of the Transportation and Utilities Committee. Are there any introductory remarks you'd like to make before we get started?
Yes, I want to let everybody know I agree with what Councilmember Herbold is saying. Very concerned about the West Seattle Bridge, and we are going to be putting on today's council agenda actually a resolution adding the West Seattle Bridge to our capital watch list because it's now become an urgent capital project. Want to make sure it's done thoroughly and quickly, and we'll be setting up additional briefings to keep the public informed about what's going on, not only with the West Seattle Bridge, but also with key bridges throughout our city, because it raises questions about the inspections and process for bridges throughout our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Peterson. So I'm going to hand it over to Director Zimbabwe to go ahead and get the presentation started. And for those of you who are video conferencing in, there's a little button that you can mute yourself on. So if you're not actively speaking, I'd ask that you mute yourself so that we don't hear any ambient noise to interrupt the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. I know this is a really challenging time for all of us in terms of having an open and transparent public dialogue about this really important issue, and I thank you for giving us the opportunity to have this platform to do so. Matt, Adium, and I are all in separate locations right now as well, and so we're going to be managing on our side as well we can across this time to be able to present to you all of this information. I would also suggest, I know there's going to be a lot of questions. We've got a lot of information that we're going to try to present as quickly as possible. If folks can use the chat function in here, we'll be able to proactively be able to answer some of those questions and be prepared to do so as quickly as possible, since I know some folks have to get off the call as well. So we recognize that this has become as a real shock at a time when there are a lot of stressors in everybody's lives. We have lots of people who are doing the extraordinary on a daily basis, and this is adding to the challenges that they face in terms of getting around for those essential things that they need to get around. We empathize with those residents, with you, the council, and want to emphasize that this was not an easy decision or a decision that we take lightly. We will continue to communicate regularly with accuracy, with transparency, and be flexible as the conditions change on the ground and as we make changes and as we have new information to share. Since last Monday, we've been providing almost daily updates to the public and to the media. We've stood up a website, www.seattle.gov/transportation/West Seattle Bridge, and mobilized our community engagement team to listen and respond to questions from the public. From our work in West Seattle of late, our ability to engage this community is well in place. Above all else, I want to convey that the Seattle Department of Transportation does not take chances when it comes to public safety. That's why we closed the West Seattle Bridge, a high-rise bridge, on March 23rd, last Monday, to all traffic. We hope today's discussion makes three things clear. First, and again, safety is our top priority, full stop. Second, the rapid announcement to close the high bridge came as a result of our ongoing and close monitoring of the conditions of the bridge. We regularly inspect our bridges, and since 2013, we've inspected our bridge, West Seattle High Bridge, at least once a year and well above the every 2 years federal standard. You'll hear that the design life of the bridge was intended for construction for the bridge to last for 75 years. During the added inspections over the last several years, there was no indication over the course of that time that the bridge was unsafe for ordinary use, and that remediation would affect the normal use of that. The preventative maintenance that we've done over the past few years did not indicate that there would be any change to the normal use of the bridge. Matt will talk a little bit more about what has changed and what's evolved over the last few months and even a few weeks to lead us to this decision that came on all of us very quickly, despite the diligence that we've shown in inspecting and maintaining this bridge. Third, this issue is absolutely top of mind for me, a key priority of SDOT, for Mayor Durkin, for all of us to work, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we've done already in the last week to put in place the project team to be able to accomplish all of what we're talking about very quickly. So you have okay, so we're sharing the presentation. We're going to go through we're going to go through an overview very quickly. We want to emphasize that all of our infrastructure ages. Usually it does so in a predictable fashion that enables us to prepare for major maintenance or replacement and set up project teams, communication, outreach to the public. And there are very few surprises. We have had some. We have a lane closed on the 4th Avenue Bridge over Argo. Late last year, WashDOT had to do emergency repairs on the Aurora Bridge that changed traffic patterns very quickly. When these infrastructure changes happen, when conditions warrant, we take swift and decisive action to maintain public safety. We know that often comes as a shock. When those things become apparent, when we have to take that action, we have to do so with the utmost care. We like to do these things in a very planned and deliberate fashion. The viaduct closure last year is a good example. It's also a similar level of traffic impact, a similar number of vehicles that are using that structure every day. We did briefing after briefing, over 40 joint community briefings, press events, other communications around the viaduct closure that were possible because it was happening in a more predictable way. There were many years of discussion about what to do about the viaduct as a whole. For reasons that we don't yet know about what's happening with the West Seattle Bridge, we were given hours to do what we previously had months or even years to do in the case of the viaduct. So we recognize that this has been a huge level of impact at a time when people have all sorts of other things that are concerning for them in their lives. We needed to take this action swiftly and decisively to maintain public safety and maintain the asset of the bridge and minimize the need for repairs overall. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. This is just a brief overview, and I know I'm going to try to keep an eye on time, but we're going to go through some of the inspection and maintenance history, our decision to close, our short-term recommendations, and what we're doing right now. what we've done and where we're going from the traffic impacts, where we think we're going from our repair options, a little bit about what we're doing to communicate, and then how we're organizing ourselves within SDOT, and then where we see as next steps. We'll try to do that as quickly as possible again, and then be able to answer questions. I know the chat function may not be effective in terms of maintaining the public dialogue, so feel free to interrupt us if you need to and ask questions as we go as well.
Director Zimbabwe.
Yes.
So we've been told that we should not use the chat
Yes.
function at all because we need to make sure that we're maintaining an appropriate public record of questions being asked. So I would ask council members, if you do want to ask a question, either jump on in or use the chat function to tell me that you have a question so that I can interrupt the presentation and allow questions to be asked. So let's try to we are all learning how to do this video conferencing together for the first time. So hopefully we can make it productive and still be orderly. So just a reminder, don't use the chat to ask questions, but if you have a question, I have the chat feature open on my computer, and if you just say I have a question, I will interrupt the presentation to allow you to ask your question.
Okay, and with this, I'm going to mute myself. Matt is going to talk about the next few items about the inspection. Adiam is going to talk about the traffic management impacts and mitigations. Matt will come back to talk about repair options, and then I'll close it out from the communications on down. So Matt, take it away.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, everybody. So a bit of background on this bridge. It was built in 1980, or opened for use in 1984, July of 1984. And it was one of the two bridges that were built to replace the old green bascule bridges that you can see in the lower left-hand corner after one of them was hit by a freighter in 1978. So in the upper right-hand section of the photo, this is actually a construction photo from when they were building the high-rise. You can see that it is two cast-in-place segmental concrete box bridges. So it's basically a reinforced concrete bridge. Comprised of two very large box beams with a monolithic slab that ties across the top of those beams. So a few things to note as we get into the defects and the deterioration that we found in our inspection program and how and why that concerned us versus normal wear and tear for a bridge. Reinforced concrete bridges are to some extent made to crack. So we anticipate that concrete will crack over time, and we perform design calculations to construct the bridge to accommodate that. I know one in particular, me as the bridge manager for the city and as a professional engineer and a certified bridge inspector, likes to see any kind of atypical deterioration. So we're typically very careful to find any deterioration and quantify it to make sure we understand that it's the normal deterioration in a structure that you would expect versus something different. A couple of things to note about this bridge: it's very unique in terms of the span lengths and its overall height. It's built essentially for our topography and geography to get up from the Duwamish River and then up into West Seattle to the up on the hill to the Alaska Junction. It was originally designed for 3 lanes of traffic in either direction, and albeit closed currently, it has 4 lanes of traffic in the eastbound direction and 3 lanes of traffic in the westbound direction. So next slide, please. So a few comments on how we got here today and what our inspection program has looked like over the last several years. Every bridge on the National Highway System, monitored by the FHWA, State DOT, and then down to city asset owners like us, is required to be inspected above water every 24 months, every 2 years. So in 2013, we had a routine inspection for this bridge, and that was the first time we noticed atypical cracking beyond what you would normally expect for this bridge type. And it triggered right away a close eye in that we hired a consulting engineering firm here in Seattle to work with us in 2014 to study this bridge and see if we could determine at that point what was causing this atypical cracking. And the results of that study weren't particularly conclusive. They recommended or pointed out a number of things that could be causing it, but the recommended action was to continue to inspect on a more regular frequency, so at least every year instead of every 2 years, and also monitor the bridge. And so that same year we installed crack width gauges with a consulting firm that does that sort of work that link back to a website so that we can monitor that data real time. And so that instrumentation was put at each one of the 4 distinct unique cracking locations that we've observed. So
Matt, can I ask you to pause? Councilmember Herbold has indicated she has a question. Councilmember Herbold, the floor is yours. You're on mute still.
I'd like to actually hold my question until after we go through the rest of the slide. I'm sorry for alerting you. I have a question, but after we go through the rest of the slide.
Okay, so Matt, once you are done speaking about this slide, can you pause to allow Councilmember Herbold to ask her a question?
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you.
So through from 2014 to 2019, we continued to perform our annual inspections and look at the crack width gauge data that we were getting on a regular basis. And, we saw the cracking continue to grow, but not at an alarming or accelerated rate. And you could actually see from the crack gauge width data that the bridge expands, the cracks are active and they expand and contract over time. But the average growth over time was very, very small, down to 1/1000 of an inch or less. So in 2019, what changed is we also do something that's required by the federal government in addition to inspections called load rating of bridges, and it's a specific calculation method to look at whether or not a bridge can handle very specific types of truck. And so those trucks are specified in terms of axle spacing and weight by the federal government. Whenever they come out with a new truck that makes it into the load rating program, the federal government comes out with a mandate that says everybody that has this type of bridge or with any type of bridge within a certain distance from the federal highway system, you have to load rate the bridge for these new trucks. So in 2013, they rolled out new trucks, and they gave us until 2022 to do the load rating. We had actually scheduled this bridge for load rating later than 2019, but in 2019, because we still had this cracking issue, we decided to move that load rating up to 2019 because we knew that the way that you can do those calculations for load rating are very specific to the types of defects that you observe. And if you see atypical defects, you're required to do a more advanced analysis, and we knew that was going to take more time, so we bumped it up in the schedule. So 2 things happened. We had these 2 parallel lines. We're doing this advanced analysis and load rating starting in 2019. We're continuing to inspect the bridge just because we need to from an inspection program standpoint, but we're also trying to gather more data to feed into the analysis so that we could really define these crack sections and understand how to accurately analyze them. Ultimately, what we did is we built a large global linear elastic model and then a localized nonlinear model to really dive deep on these crack sections and understand their behavior so that we could do a responsible load rating. As we're gathering data for that analysis, we could see the cracking patterns in the bridge start to change and accelerate. And so by late February, we had gotten to the point where our consultant partner that was working on this with us had recommended going down to 2 lanes in either direction. And as we were preparing to do that, planning how we would execute that from a traffic control standpoint and outreach, and then preparing to alert the mayor's office and city council and everyone else that needs to know about this, as we were, like the day we were having the briefing, or just the day before, I got a call from our consultant partner, and they changed the recommendation from restricting down to 2 lanes to closure. And that was on March 19th. So I had a briefing with Sam and other leadership at the DOT on the 20th. We discussed the lane closures and this change in recommendation, and then I spent Friday evening and through the weekend going through and consuming all of that information or digesting it, and then made the call to bring my engineering team and our consultant partner up onto the bridge at 9 a.m. on Monday morning. So that brings me to the next slide, to the decision to close. This is what we saw when we got up there. There's a couple of things.
Hold on, Matt.
Oh,
Hold on, Matt.
sorry.
Matt wants to have a question answered now.
I really appreciate it. I just want to, again, raise the issue of notice to the public and transparency as really being critical. I'm of the opinion that is when we moved to monthly inspections, that the public and the council should have been notified. One really useful way to do that, I believe, is through our capital projects reports that come to the council. There is actually a program related, I believe, to the work that you've been doing. There's a bridge load rating CIP project. It would have been really useful if in the third quarter report last year we had been notified, because again, the notification process through those quarterly reports through project review is intended to notify the council of increased risk around particular programs and projects. And this is not as it relates specifically to the bridge load rating, it's not a specific project, but it is a program, and it's a program that you are doing for a number of bridges. But at the point at which you decided that you needed to expedite the bridge load rating for the West Seattle Bridge, and you moved to monthly inspections, I think it would have been a really useful thing. As I mentioned earlier, there's a really a universal response of shock, and in some cases anger from constituents in West Seattle about this. So in keeping with our commitment to transparency and no surprises and preparation, I would really appreciate the department to think about how to adjust its reporting so that we can move towards a culture of, again, no surprises. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. I'll just jump in to respond. I think we all hear that and understand it. I think, again, going back to what I said at the very beginning, it wasn't until very, very recently that we thought that any of the repair needed for the bridge would change any normal daily traffic patterns on the bridge in terms of what it would take for repair. So I totally hear, we all hear the concern, and are happy to figure out ways to make sure we're communicating transparently. If we had started that reporting last fall, it wouldn't have said we think we might need to close the bridge, because that wasn't something that we were planning for at that point.
Thank you. So on this slide where it says October, November, December, began analyzing mitigation options, closing the bridge was not one of those options that you were considering at that time. Is that accurate?
That's right. That's right. Mitigation meant in terms of how do we mitigate the cracking, not what traffic mitigations need to be done.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Just to follow up on that line of questioning, so if we're looking at this slide, which is slide 4, sort of, at what point in time was closure to traffic considered as a potential option that would be required to address the cracking?
The first time that we received an indication from our consultant teaming partner that they were going to recommend going down to 2 lanes in each direction was February 21st.
So then February 21st was lane reduction under consideration that shows up here, and then and we didn't receive notice until what, last week?
That's right, and I think when we got the initial, it was not an immediate, this needs to happen tomorrow lane restriction, and we started to put together what it would take from a traffic mitigation, what that would start to look like from a traffic management plan perspective, because the indication at that point was that this was something we had to seriously consider, but that we didn't have to do that immediately. This was at the same time, as everybody knows, this was at the same time as the department and the city has been responding to COVID-19 and putting a lot of different practices in place and things like that were also consuming attention. That didn't stop our inspection procedures, but it did make it more difficult to have some of the preparatory discussions, even for what lane restrictions would look like. So we totally understand the frustration, the concern about this, and we'll seek to from here forward on this project and on all projects, we seek to have that dialogue as early as we think possible in not unduly alarming the public, but also making sure we're open and accurate and transparent in our communications with you and the public as a whole.
I think to Councilmember Herbold's point, it was about 3 to 4 weeks before the city council found out that the lane reduction, in this case, full closure, was going to occur. And we found out just a few hours before the general public found out, and our constituents learned that they would no longer have access to the West Seattle Bridge. And so I think that over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, there could have been more proactive engagement, certainly of, at a minimum, the chair of the Transportation and Utilities Committee and the district representative for District 1. And so I'm disappointed that proactive engagement did not occur, and that it took sort of this severe action for the department to acknowledge that moving forward it needs to engage city council members on issues of such significant import. And so I understand and appreciate that we're all under pressure, but we still have an obligation to communicate with each other. And I think that obligation is escalated and even more serious now, and is a little harder to do, which means we have to be much more proactive in figuring out how to engage with each other. And I think all of the council members here, and I know Councilmember Herbold in particular, takes very serious the responsibility to be accountable to our constituents and to communicate transparently. And I think the department could have done a better job in engaging council members as it relates to this particular issue. I appreciated the 3 hours heads up. So I didn't find out about it for the first time in the media, but I think we can do better. I know we can do better in terms of how we communicate this kind of critical information with each other.
Understood. And again, I don't want to belabor this point. I want to be unequivocal that we are committed to that same level of transparency. The recommendation for closure did not come to us until Friday, March 19th. It wasn't until Matt himself went up on the bridge on Monday morning, March 23rd. Thursday, March 19th. Monday, Matt went up on the bridge on March 23rd in the morning, confirmed what the recommendation was, saw the growth, which we'll go into in the next slide. And then from that point, once we have that level of recommendation, we can't take the time to brief everybody and make sure we have all plans in place. We have to take swift and decisive action. So I fully appreciate that there is frustration that we could have had some more discussion in the weeks leading up to it. We will seek to do that from here on forward with this. There was also at that point not an indication that we had to take such swift action to maintain public health and safety. So again, I don't want to get too bogged down in this. I think we have a shared commitment to openness and transparency, and a shared commitment to informing and being open and transparent going forward.
Great. Let's move along.
Okay, thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the decision to close on Monday, we saw rapid and unexpected growth in the bridge over the course of days or weeks. And because public safety is the #1 priority, and for myself as a certified bridge inspector with over 20 years of experience, if you look at the blue lines in that photo, that is growth that occurred between the 5th of March, which was the earliest time in March that I was in the bridge, and the 23rd when we went out to see the bridge. That type of growth in a reinforced concrete structure is completely unacceptable. That's typically the type of growth you see over years, not over weeks and days. And so that drove me primarily as a bridge inspector and the bridge manager for the city to pick up the phone from inside the girder in the bridge and call Lorelei, my deputy director, to alert Sam that we needed to close the bridge that day. That caused extreme concern with leaving live load or vehicular live load on the bridge of the risk of public safety. So we have a graphic here that shows that progression over months and then weeks towards the end of it. The other thing to note here is that in the structural bridge world, angular cracks like that, or at a diagonal, are called shear cracks. That type of deterioration in a bridge will go until failure, and then failure happens typically quickly and without warning, as opposed to other type of cracking that's not oriented in that way. So that exacerbates the concern at this point, that it's a failure mechanism that could happen very, very quickly without the bridge deforming or changing shape before it actually gives way, in addition to the rate of that crack growth. So if we could go on to the next slide. So what are we going to do about it? Short-term recommendations for the high pass. We are and are going to continue to take all steps to maintain the integrity of the structure. And we need to return the bridge to normal operations as soon as possible. We are going to, when we do those repairs, we're going to see if we can do it in a way that it returns some traffic to the bridge ahead of going back to full operations. Part of the maintaining the integrity, of course, was to restrict traffic, but we will be up there weekly continuing to inspect these cracks to make sure that what we think now, that the bridge can handle its own dead weight, continues to be true. And we've got a suite of instrumentation mechanisms and techniques that will not only help us monitor the bridge, but help us gather early data for how the mechanics of these crack sections actually work, to help us start thinking about design or repairs even before we actually start the design process. And back to the design process, we're looking at different alternative methods like design build or DCCM as a way to accelerate the design process and cut down on lead time for materials, which can become an issue.
Okay, great. Just before you move on, Matt, we have 3 council members in the queue. We're going to hear first from Councilmember Morales, and then we will hear from Councilmember Peterson, and then Councilmember Herbold also has a question. So, Councilmember Morales, you have the floor.
Thank you. So, when you were saying that graphic you showed seemed pretty quick, the rate of the cracks expanding. It makes me wonder if there's any way for you to know if that sudden disaster happens, what the timeline for that might be. But the reason I ask that is because if we're still allowing people on the lower bridge, and there's a chance that the upper bridge might collapse at any moment, I'm worried that we're still putting people at risk if they are using the under bridge to get across.
So excellent points and observation. We don't think that there is a risk that the bridge could collapse at any moment. We think that the bridge is currently stable, particularly because we took live load for vehicles off of it. But because of the cost of being wrong about that, we're going to continue to monitor the bridge to make sure that we're right. Mayor Durkin very astutely pointed out in our briefing to her last Monday that those same points, and asked us to expedite modeling of failure mechanisms to see if the bridge did go to failure, what would happen, and to come up with an emergency response plan so that if we started to see behavior we don't like, that we knew exactly in stepped fashion how to quickly mitigate risk for any infrastructure or people that currently work around the bridge. Our own bridge, the low bridge, the railroad bridge to the south, Harbor Freight, the light industrial complex on the south end of Harbor Island. So we began working on that last week.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Peterson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to echo the comments and concerns raised by Councilmember Herbold and Council President Gonzalez about notification. And to put a finer point on that, when there is a recommendation from an engineer for lane reductions, that we would like to have the immediate notification for that as well, so that we can have a rapid discussion on how to communicate to our constituents about that, because lane closures are something that sound very serious, should be taken seriously and communicated with that level of seriousness to our constituents if we do need to close lanes on several of the bridges throughout the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Peterson. We have Councilmember Herbold, who also has a question. So, Councilmember Herbold, the floor is yours. And you might be on mute.
Yes, thank you. The bullet point that references the goal of seeking interim repairs with the goal of restoring some traffic. Are you suggesting that there might be a possibility of adding a lane back at some point before a more general reopening?
That's correct. We won't really be able to determine that until we get down into the weeds on the shoring design that has to happen first. But we are going to take that lens to see what we can return in a stepped fashion along the way to full operations.
And related to the following bullet point around accelerating major maintenance and repair to extend the bridge life, can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned design build approaches. Can you talk a little bit more about what sort of options would allow you to accelerate the repair to not only extend the bridge life, but also to address the need to restore traffic as soon as possible?
Sure. The classic method for delivering, say, a capital structural project is design, bid, build. So you go through the entire design process, then you put it out for bid, select a contractor, and build it. There are other ways to do that where you have the designer of record and a contractor or constructor of the repairs working hand in hand earlier in the process to cut down on difficulties in construction that weren't really realized in the design process.
Yes, thank you. I understood that process. I was asking if there are other strategies beyond that process, because I believe the design build contracting process is fairly standard these days, and I might be wrong on that, but it seems like this requires some extraordinary out-of-the-box thinking to move this work forward as quickly as possible.
So one of the things, to that point, one of the things that we're already trying to do is combine or really look at how we're doing monitoring for the safety of the bridge, to combine that with gathering the stress and strain data and how the bridge currently carries its own weight as a way to get ahead of design. I mean, typically that's not something you would start until you began the official design process. We're already doing that now.
Thank you. I would just like to throw out that given the fact that we have 17,000 folks who travel the bridge via transit every day and another 100,000 vehicles, that we should really look to see whether or not there are still additional strategies that we can consider. This is, like I mentioned earlier, truly an emergency for West Seattle commuters, and I just would like to see whether or not there are extraordinary approaches that could be used to address these extraordinary circumstances.
And I'll just jump in. I think that we're looking for any possible way to get to return bridge to normal operations as quickly as possible, to restore any amount of traffic as quickly as possible. We will not do that until it is safe to do so, and we will also not go out of step in terms of making decisions that end up putting us in a difficult position to do so safely and successfully. So we are right there with you in terms of getting things done as quickly as possible and looking for all the possible ways to accelerate this process. We will be happy to have that conversation as we go forward. But I also want to be very clear that we're not going to make decisions that end up, putting ourselves in financial risk and risk of not being able to successfully make those repairs in trying to be expedient over being prudent.
That was not my suggestion. I appreciate you clarifying that. I am speaking to treating this like an emergency, as well as it relates to the contracting processes that were discussed before, and appreciate obviously that we need to move forward in a way that is responsible and prudent and bounded by concerns around public safety. So thank you.
Absolutely, we share that.
All right, let's go ahead and move along.
Next slide, please. So to a previous comment, we also are looking at the swing bridge very carefully. We've had some ongoing issues that we've been addressing over the past months. just in a normal course of asset preservation for this bridge, but now, of course, it's got a laser focus on it because it is the primary bypass route from the high pass for commercial freight, emergency responders, and transit. So things that we're doing right now and will continue to do are weekly inspections and monitoring of particular areas of this bridge as it continues to be more heavily loaded with traffic. We coincidentally, several weeks or a few months ago, began a load rating project for this bridge and the approaches on either side, so we're going to bring that to a close. We've had problematic pedestrian gates that need to move and lock in a particular sequence in an opening cycle that we've had problems with, so those things have a particular long lead time. We ordered them towards the end of last year, recently received those, and we have a maintenance installations plan for that coming up in a couple weeks in April. We also have an ongoing capital project for the control system to replace the control system for that bridge. And as some of you may remember, in 2018, we had an outage of the Pier 6 or western side, the pier that's in this photo. Lift cylinder went out on us, and so we had to pull it out, put in our spare cylinder, and we're bringing a forensic analysis and rehabilitation program for that cylinder and the currently still in service Pier 7 cylinder this year. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adia Memri for the traffic management plan.
Thank you, Matt. In regards to traffic, the level of effort and complexity of closing West Seattle Bridge is very similar to the viaduct, if not more complicated. Those two infrastructures carry the same amount of average daily traffic, the viaduct being 100,000 and West Seattle 84,000. With the viaduct, we had ample time to develop strategies to partner with our partnering agencies to have trip reduction or enhance our transit routes and so forth, or inform the public in also participating in minimizing their trips. With West Seattle, we didn't have that luxury. We, as stated prior, we implemented emergency closure a week ago, within 5 hours. And one of the things that we understand that, West Seattle has very limited crossing points of the waterway. First Avenue South Bridge being the infrastructure that can address or handle a lot of the reroutes. On the north end of West Seattle, we have Lower Spokane Bridge with very, very limited capacity, 20,000 being the maximum capacity that it can handle, which actually translates to a stop-and-go traffic if we allow about 20,000 people to utilize Lower Spokane Bridge. Hence, we've limited the usage of Lower Spokane Bridge for emergency responders, transit, and freight to make sure that we are not impeding emergency vehicles' response rate and so forth to West Seattle residents. We're redirecting currently everyone to South Park. We're also being aware and cautious about where we're redirecting this traffic, making sure that we have proper mitigation. So we've expedited a signal to be built at Highland Parkway and Holden. I'm happy to announce that it is operational. It was turned on yesterday, so it's operating right now. We're making sure that we are adding more traffic count stations, making sure that we're data-driven as we assess our mitigation approach moving forward, not forgetting out South Park residents and making sure that neighborhood streets such as South Park is not inundated with traffic impact. So we'll continue to mitigate and strategize with how we manage this traffic. Next slide, please.
Before you move on, Councilmember Herbold has indicated she has a question about this slide.
Thank you so much. I want to just repeat my earlier thanks for your quick action to install the temporary traffic signal at Highland Parkway and Southwest Holden. As it relates specifically to monitoring the traffic count, thank you for adding traffic count stations. I'm interested to know how frequently you will have reports on those traffic counts, and what your plan is to share that information with particularly myself and Transportation Chair Peterson. And then I think just because I'm really interested to know as new traffic patterns develop, how quickly you might be able to consider adjusting access. You've made a commitment that you are making those decisions on a data-based approach, and I want to understand a little bit more with some additional granularity how frequently you will be monitoring those traffic patterns, and in particular, I want to put another plug in. I'm hearing a lot from our healthcare workers who are, they're nurses, firefighters, police officers, EMTs. They're working a lot of overtime. They're not taking public transit so that they can be more likely to stay healthy as they're driving to their jobs. And I'm really hoping that, of course, bounded by principles of public safety, that there is an approach, a traffic mitigation approach that allows the consideration of the expansion of the lower level bridge for some of those workers.
Okay, I'll be happy to take. So where we have currently traffic counts is at the Lower Spokane Bridge, which we can report on a daily basis. The first influx that we saw after the closure on a Tuesday, we saw a 15,000 crossing at Lower Spokane, which really stressed the emergency responders, and we heard a lot about from our partnering agency, like responders, to say this is it's not reliable. So we want to make sure that the restriction on Lower Spokane continues, but again, as you stated, we will be data-driven, and if there are opportunities in which to open it up, maybe in the late evening and so forth, if there are capacity, we will continuously consider those things. The new added data points, once we have them in place, we'll be very happy to report out daily or weekly in terms of analysis. From engineering perspective, we're utilizing those data to tweak our signal timing, adjust other things continuously on a daily basis. That being said, I want to kind of stress the level of the Lower Spokane Bridge. Clearly, it's the closest to the north end of the West Seattle Bridge in terms of the waterway crossing, but keeping it available and reliable for emergency responders, especially in the time that we're in, it's very, very essential. So I want to make sure that we place the restriction for the time in which we've restricted it for now. We are keeping in mind keeping our vulnerable users, pedestrians and the bikes and transit in mind as we help mitigate and adjust with all the routes where we are directing other traffic to go through. So it's a continuous monitoring and adjustment takes place.
I'll also just jump in there and say that that right now we're in an extraordinary traffic period too. We've seen massive declines in following the stay home, stay healthy order. People are following that and are not traveling in the way that they normally would. And so right now, we know our traffic levels are very different. Even with that, as Adiam said, when in the first couple of days of the closure, despite putting in restrictions on the lower bridge, we saw 15,000 people a day or 15,000 vehicles a day using that bridge. And so if and when things come back to normal, let's say I'm optimistic that things will be back to normal hopefully soon, from a traffic perspective, we've got to be very careful about not taxing overstressing our infrastructure as well, knowing that there are these impacts. So we are very committed again to sharing and figuring out the best ways. During the VITA closure, we created dashboards where we were communicating very on an automated basis, basically what traffic impacts were. We're very committed to doing the same things. This is unfortunately not going to be a short-term issue that we have to deal with, and we're going to have to figure out ways to share information and adapt as we go forward.
That's right. Next slide, please. The detour map indicates, was what we stated, where the detours are, and advancing everyone to head to First Avenue if you're in and then limiting the lower Spokane Bridge. And here I just want to kind of acknowledge, like, especially people that live in the north end of West Seattle, we are asking them to travel. We're adding 5 more miles their travel time to get back into 99 via First Avenue South, and we recognize that's it could be a challenge for some, but I think, as Sam stated, when we go back to normal, this has a special request in which, like, number of trips need to be reduced in order to mitigate this impact that we're seeing. Right now, with regional, volume reduction, we're not seeing that many impacts, but just the level of, traffic that we're moving on West Seattle Bridge on a daily basis of 84,000, it's going to require a lot of strategies and so forth, and to reduce the number of personal trips that we're making moving forward. So next slide, please. This is just kind of reiterating what Sam indicated. We do have, we're planning what the strategies will be as we get back into normal traffic pattern. We do have a task force set with King County Metro and the port to strategize and how we handle this impact that has been introduced to our network, and exactly the same level of effort that we've seen in the viaduct. That's the type of level that we anticipate to implement moving forward. Now I'm going to pass it on to Matt.
Thanks, Adia. So repair options, what are we going to do to get this bridge back into service? First, we need to put in temporary shoring to preserve the structure, and that's primarily to make it safe for a contractor to be on the bridge to do more extensive repairs. The approach to those repairs, at this point, we think it's likely going to be carbon fiber wrapping with additional reinforcement at key connections. Carbon fiber wrapping it's a woven carbon fiber mesh that's a fabric that you can lay up onto the bridge and anchor down, and then you coat it with a type of epoxy, and when that hardens up, it forms a shell that additionally reinforces or provides more integrity to the bridge. We'll likely combine that with, there is post-tensioning strand or steel strand embedded in the concrete that was tightened up as part of the original construction and then locked down. We can still use that technique to put additional post-tensioning strand either inside the hollow part of the girders or on the outside if necessary, depending on how the mechanics of those crack sections ultimately work out. As I mentioned before, we're going to look at alternative delivery methods. We also need to be really careful in our design to see if we can do it in such a way that it doesn't impact the box that's around, theoretical box that's around the federal navigation channel beneath the bridge into Duwamish. So if you cross into the plane of the horizontal limits of that navigation channel, or if you change the clearance of the bridge, it triggers a federal permit through the Coast Guard that could add significant time to critical path if we can't stay outside of that box. And I think with the next slide is back over to Sam to talk about communications.
Sure. So just trying to wrap up here as well. And thanks to everybody for their time on this. So we've already talked about our commitment to openness and transparency. We've stood up a website. We're continuing to share this information. We have an ongoing partnership with Department of Neighborhoods to connect with community and open those feedback channels so that we can problem solve in real time with people, and then make sure that we keep everybody up to date as new information is available, as we have sort of a regular rhythm of information to share, and as we come upon major milestones. I see that Councilmember Herbold has a question here, so I can hold.
Councilmember Herbold, you're on mute, and then after Councilmember Herbold, Councilmember Mosqueda has a question as well.
Thank you. So as it relates to communications, I think part of communications also includes making sure that the public understands what the enforcement practices are. So if you could just speak to how we are planning to enforce the restriction of the lower level bridge to the freight, transit, and first responders and other populations of drivers as those restrictions are considered for relaxation?
Sure. So right now we've got signs out indicating who is permitted to travel, and we have support from the police department in trying to make sure that people follow those. We're trying to figure out what the best practice and how to best do that. I think we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of people violating those restrictions, which has led to challenges in managing the traffic flow. So our general approach to enforcement of all of our traffic rules is to have people follow the rules as we set them out and have as light an enforcement touch as possible. If we can't get results that we need through that, then we'll have to reevaluate those strategies.
Yeah,
I think ultimately, if we have everybody trying to use the lower bridge, nobody will be able to use the lower bridge.
Right, and as you note, I think a lot of folks are continuing to use the lower level bridge. So this is an area that I'd like to have some continuing conversation with you about. I obviously am speaking on one hand to the interest of using the lower level bridge for more commuters as is safe in the future, but I also have real concerns about the extent to which it's being used now in conflict with the current the current restrictions.
Absolutely. I think that's also a place where we know that some of this, not everybody reads our blog or gets our Twitter stream, and so I think some people are used to doing things the way that they're used to doing them, and we want to make sure that people are getting information about these restrictions so that they know how to plan their trips to make alternatives. But it's going to be something that we all need to work together as the community to make sure we use that bridge to the best extent possible.
Thank you. Councilmember Mosqueda, are you on the line? And if you are,
I am.
Got the floor.
Thank you, Council President, and thanks to Director Zimbabwe and SDOT for this presentation. It's just two brief points. One, I just biked into the CenturyLink field for this tour, and I'll have to leave it to your team to assess the current situation this morning, but I just want to echo the concerns around first responders being stuck in traffic right now and people clearly using that as a shortcut. I hope that some of them are medical providers, but it does appear that there's a number of people who are not first responders and not in a commercial transit mobiles that would be clogging up the lower bridge, and just want to flag that for you. I also echo Councilmember Herbold's point that it'd be a desire to make sure that that is also a viable traffic pathway for not just healthcare providers, but also those who are human service providers, people providing assistance to our homeless population and to those in permanent supportive housing. So just want to flag that. And then my question for you was on your second to last slide. You mentioned the way in which we're going to try to adhere to a quick response and a long-term response. In our quick response, can you speak to the safety of the workers? What are precautions that we're going to put into place so that we can make sure that, yes, the bridge is a safety hazard if not fixed, but how are we going to keep our workers protected from COVID exposure?
Sure. So we've already implemented social distancing guidelines for all of our staff and are working with all of our construction sites to implement updated safety plans that take into account health best practices as it relates to COVID exposure. As Matt said, some of the way that the bridge is built, the hollow nature of the bridge is a pretty tight and enclosed space, and so as we look to even installing the shoring, we'll need to make sure that we have the ability to keep the workforce safe that is doing this essential work to get the bridge reopen. So none of this is made easier by the public health emergency in which we find ourselves. We need to keep all of those issues front and center as we work on some of these critical infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Council President. I want to just flag for Director Zimbabwe. I appreciate all the work that you and I have already chatted about in terms of truly essential construction work. I think this is a great example of what's actually essential. And I'm going to continue to raise questions about construction that is not essential with other projects in our region that have a deadline of 2023. I think my concern remains, what is an additional 2 to 4 weeks stay to keep our workers protected? I think this is in a different category where obviously the safety of our community is at stake. So thanks for your ongoing work now and in the future to make sure that we're actually addressing what's essential and letting our construction workers stay home if it's not. I think this is a great example and appreciate your protection of workers' safety.
Council President?
Yeah,
This is Councilmember Strauss.
Oh, Councilmember Strauss, please, you have the floor.
I'm also just about to enter a CenturyLink deal with the event center with Councilmember Mosqueda, and I want to echo all of her thoughts, which I think are spot on, as well as echoing Councilmember Peterson and Thibault's appreciation for the fast movement of SDOT to take safety measures as a priority, as well as more information earlier is always appreciated. And again, just want to highlight, thank you, SDOT, and to your team for moving quickly to ensure public safety.
Thank you, Councilmember Strauss. Director Zimbabwe, I know that we've gone quite long, but I do just sort of want to, on this slide, which is about the communications plan, I really want to put in a plug for utilizing our local media to get out as much information as possible to people in West Seattle, and to do that through the lens of not just English, but also for our limited English proficiency or non-English proficient populations, of which there are many in West Seattle, both as it relates to detours and staying off of the lower bridge unless you fall into the appropriate population, but also as it relates to traffic impacts and mitigation. So District 1 is incredibly diverse as it relates to language and economic position, and I just want to make sure that we are looking at this through the lens of leveraging local media that is really critically important to getting out that information. So in South Park, I know CMAR has strong channels of communication with community members in South Park, and for West Seattle, a lot of folks follow the West Seattle blog. So I'm going to put in a little plug for our friends over at the West Seattle blog to make sure that SDOT is working very closely with them and others throughout District 1 to make sure that folks really understand what's at stake here, and particularly as it relates to why it's important to not just shortcut through the lower bridge, and people need to really understand what's at stake if they're not following the restrictions as outlined by the city.
Get all those points, and I think that's also where our partnership with Department of Neighborhoods helps us make sure that we're communicating out in a broadly and accessible way. The West Seattle blog is, I think we all know, just critical for anything that's happening in West Seattle, and Tracy was our first interview with the media on this, and we'll look to having continuing that channel. I completely agree that it is essential that we get information about this, both about the repair and about the ongoing mitigation and detours and stuff like that, out as broadly as possible so that we can be successful. Our last slide, and I know we've had a lot of this dialogue along the way, but really just about how we're structuring ourselves very quickly to tackle this. This is not something that falls within one work group within SDOT. It's really touching all of us very quickly. Folks know, I think Heather Marks, who was instrumental in our success around the viaduct closure last year and bringing public information and bringing together all the things that needed to happen from an SDOT perspective. I've asked her to take the lead on coordinating all of the work that needs to happen with West Seattle Bridge. Matt, as who've heard from, is leading on the structural aspects. Adiam, who you've heard from, is leading on the traffic management aspects. Dan Anderson, who's been leading a lot of our communication on the Delridge multimodal corridor, Delridge rapid ride investments, and so has a lot of ties and knowledge with community, is leading on our public information. And Emily Reardon, who's our deputy chief of staff, is our agency liaison, working with other agencies and bringing other people together very quickly. For you all on the council, Shauna Larson, our council liaison, is also an invaluable resource for you in terms of channeling questions or requests through Shauna. She's tied in with this team as well. And then this is really just a critical. We all know this is a critical piece of work that is where we've rapidly stood up this team within the context of our public health response right now, our COVID response, tied into all the emergency response that we're doing there. But then this will sort of live on as a structure that will guide us through this whole process. So I just want to reinforce again that we are taking this incredibly seriously and working to organize ourselves to be successful in delivering on restoring the bridge.
Thank you so much, Director Zimbabwe, and to all the staff over at SDOT for joining us in short order to do this presentation. Before we conclude, I know that Councilmember Herbold has another question about next steps, and so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her, and she might actually be gearing up to ask the question that I was thinking about. So I'm not gonna ask my question until I hear what Councilmember Herbold has to say. Please, Councilmember Herbold, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Council President. So since we are, I think, oh, great, the next step slide's up. So as it relates specifically to our next steps and to both the near term and the long term repairs, it would be really helpful to know how it is you intend to fund the short term repairs as soon as possible, what SDOT can do to address or identify which projects they can no longer afford to do so we can make these funds available, and whether or not council action is needed. I am assuming it would, to authorize shifting some resources, and when will we have more of a picture on that?
Yeah, so those are all good questions. Yes, there will be budget impacts on the whole of the SDOT program in terms of taking these steps. And I think those will be discussions that we need to have. Those likely we need to get a little bit of a better handle on what exactly the repair and the sort of shoring and then repair options are. We expect that'll happen over the next few weeks and can have some more of that discussion. And this is at the same time as we all know and recognize, I think CBO Director Ben Noble has been very clear about some of the challenges we're facing as a city in response to, in the economic response to COVID-19 as well. So I think there's a lot that will be coming around the budget and how this fits into all of that, and it'll be a dialogue that we will need to have. So I don't know I have exact timing on that, but recognize that it will have to be a key something that we engage on. I just want to also last year, beyond where we are right now in terms of shoring and then repair, we also recognize that there's a need to start talking about what the long term is beyond even repair, and have a similar to what we've been doing on the Ballard Bridge recently and other bridges where we have a little bit more lead time on these types of discussions, of having a real in-depth, robust discussion of what our options are beyond sort of the immediate near term situation that we find ourselves in right now. So that's something that will come. That's not our immediate priority right now, but it's something that we need to start doing as soon as we possibly can as well.
Great, thank you so much. And then in terms of the next steps here, something that I still am missing in terms of the piece of information and would appreciate knowing what the department is thinking around this is sort of timelines around some of those short-term solutions that you identified and of course the long-term solutions. And can you give us a sense of when sort of the timeline of implementation or processing related to those two different sets of solutions identified in the previous slides?
Yeah, I'm still, this is obviously taken us a little bit, this accelerated faster than we thought it would. And so I don't right now have as much as information as I would like to have and be talking about with you in terms of some of those things. And I think some of that will go hand in hand with what the budgetary impacts might be of either the short or the long term, like the immediate and the sort of midterm repair options. I do know that unfortunately, it's not going to be a short duration, and I don't want to give the impression that this is something that we are going to handle within the next few weeks or something like that. We're working to do it as quickly as possible and to do all the things that we need to do, but it's going to be something that unfortunately I think will outlast the public health emergency that we find ourselves in right now, which is a reason why we also need to be thinking proactively about what the traffic mitigations are as things get back to a state of normalcy as well.
So, Director Zimbabwe, as you sit here today, you and your staff can't give the City Council any sort of sense of a timeline as it relates to the short-term goals and the long-term goals of repair.
I think this, a week after this, we made this decision to close the bridge. I am very reluctant to speculate on what those timelines are because I think at this point, if any range that I give would likely be would likely have problems, and I'm very reluctant to even try to speculate on it because I think it'll put out a false sense that we have a better understanding of the path forward than we currently do.
I can appreciate that. We certainly don't want to create timelines for ourselves that are not going to be realistic if it set a false expectation for people who rely on the West Seattle Bridge for moving about, whether it's people on buses or people in cars. But I do think it's important for the City Council to get a sense of what the process will be that the department is going to undertake to be able to get to a point where it has a high level of confidence in establishing the timeline, whether that's by phases or for the complete project, right? And I understand that we're only a week after the decision was made and it was made public that there would be a full closure of the West Seattle Bridge. But I do think it's incumbent upon us to get a better understanding from you all at SDOT what the process will look like for determining what relevant timelines might be. Is that something that the department can do?
Yes, we can do that. I think that it will be over the next month or so that we have a better sense of where and what we need to do, and we start to put some of those actions in place at the same time. So I'm very committed to sharing that with the council as we have more information about it. And I think the next 3-4 weeks are what we'll need to be able to come back with a bit better information and answers to all those questions.
I appreciate that. That gives me a better sense of sort of how long the process will take to evaluate timelines, and I think that is helpful. So what I'm hearing from you is that in the next 3 to 4 weeks, you'll have a better sense of what potential timelines could look like. What I would ask of you now is for a commitment to work with Councilmember Herbold and Councilmember Peterson and my office in making sure that we are in tight communication around what that process is and what potential timelines might look like as it relates to both the short-term strategies and the long-term strategies of repair of the West Seattle Bridge. Is that something that you all could do?
Absolutely.
Great. I don't have any other questions at this time. Are there any of my other colleagues that have questions before I close out this presentation? Okay, I'm not hearing from anyone. I just wanted to really quickly thank SDOT for all of the quick work that you all did. I think, obviously I expressed some frustration at the top of the presentation as it relates to the timing of when notification was given to us, but I don't want that expression of frustration to minimize the hard work that I know that SDOT is doing. I want to especially thank Matt for his quick work in recognizing that this was a serious public safety issue for the people of Seattle, and I can only imagine sort of how significant it was for Matt to undertake that decision and to see what you saw in that moment with your own eyes, to be able to make that call and to do it quickly for the best interest of all users of the West Seattle Bridge. I really just want to thank you, Matt, for making that tough call and for doing the work that was necessary to make sure that we as a city acted quickly to preserve life and safety. I know that this is an inconvenience for many folks in West Seattle or people who come in and out of West Seattle, but at the end of the day, we have a paramount duty to preserve life and safety of those people who use or may use the West Seattle Bridge, and I'm really proud of the work that SDOT did to step into action to do that. And so we're all going to have to give just a little bit more amidst this crisis to travel those additional 5 miles to get to where we need to get during this period of time and beyond. So thank you all for your work, and Matt especially for all the work that you're doing on this as well.